The stars loomed in the void, indifferent and eternal. Among them, the Zyreen Imperium reigned, a civilization that had outlived empires, its wars fought with precision and ceremony. Conflict, to them, was an art, an intricate dance of tactics and strategy where warriors clashed not to kill, but to prove superiority. For the Zyreen, war was a game, a structured engagement bound by rules and honor, with surrender as the final move, and no blood ever truly spilled. Then came humanity. Their arrival on the galactic stage had been unremarkable at first. A young species, ambitious yet restrained, they navigated diplomacy with care, eager to integrate yet wary of unseen dangers. When the Zyreen extended an invitation to the great trials, the galactic community watched with idle curiosity. Another species, another player in the ceremonial war. Humanity accepted Major Elias Vance had read the reports. A dozen races had participated in the Zyreen's war games, each respecting the sanctity of the ritual, each engaging in bloodless battles, and each, inevitably, had lost, for they played by the rules set before them. But the reports did not concern him. The Zyreen misunderstood humanity. War, for them, was entertainment. War, for humanity, was survival. The war games began. The battlefield was chosen, an isolated planetoid, rich in mineral deposits, a contested prize that held no true strategic value beyond the game. The Zyreen deployed their forces with practiced ease, armored warriors taking formation in neat, disciplined ranks. Energy barriers shimmered around them, safeguarding combatants from fatal blows, stun weapons, precision maneuvers, an elegant battle unfolding like a well-rehearsed performance. The humans did not form ranks. They dug in. When the Zyreen's first offensive line advanced, they met silence, until the first of them collapsed, struck from unseen angles. No warning shots, no ritualized engagement, just sudden, ruthless efficiency. The Zyreen hesitated. There were no signals, no heralds to declare combat had begun. The human forces did not move like warriors. They moved like predators. Panic rippled through the Zyreen command. Their warriors were being picked off systematically, their shields overwhelmed, their formations crumbling. It took minutes, mere minutes, for the Zyreen to realize that this was not a game. Overseer Relvok watched in growing dread as his forces faltered. Their warriors, unaccustomed to true combat, faltered under the sheer brutality of human tactics. They fought to win, but the humans fought to end. And then came the moment of irreversible consequence. One of the Zyreen strike teams, in a desperate attempt to reclaim control, pushed past the human defenses. Their orders were simple: disable, capture, declare victory. They breached a human outpost, taking control of a civilian colony established near the battle zone. They had done this before, conquered, occupied, only to restore and return the land after the trials concluded. That was the game, but the humans did not see it that way. A transmission cut across all frequencies, a human distress beacon. The Zyreen had attacked a civilian colony. Silence. Then a chilling response. Acknowledged. Engaging total warfare. The Zyreen had made a fatal error. The humans had been holding back. The war games were over. The Zyreen didn't understand what they had done. Overseer Relvok stood frozen before the holographic map, his elongated fingers trembling as red markers flickered across the battlefield. Human forces, once restrained, now moved with terrifying precision. There were no ritualized maneuvers, no pauses for strategy, just relentless advance, calculated destruction. This was not a counterattack. It was extermination. The distress signal from the occupied colony had barely finished broadcasting when the first retaliatory strike fell. A Zyreen forward operating base, stationed near a supply line, was vaporized in seconds. No warnings, no demands for surrender. The Zyreen had fought hundreds of engagements in the Great Trials, but never had a species ignored the rules. "This isn't possible," one of his tacticians muttered, voice edged with disbelief. The humans, why are they attacking outside designated combat zones? Relvok said nothing. He had seen the glint in the human commander's eyes before the battle had begun, had sensed something feral, unchained beneath the surface of their disciplined posturing. And now, with one foolish move, they had unleashed it. The wargame protocols dictated that hostilities pause after a significant shift in battlefield control. The Zyreen had taken the colony, a tactical victory under the rules of the trials. In every engagement before, the defeated forces would surrender, acknowledge their loss, and prepare for restoration. But the humans did not surrender. They retaliated. The first wave of human shock troops descended upon the Zyreen-occupied colony, like a storm. Their armored drop pods shattered the sky, slamming into enemy positions with kinetic force, rupturing buildings and sending Zyreen warriors sprawling. Unlike before, there were no non-lethal weapons, no energy barriers to prevent fatalities. They moved in silence, sweeping through the streets like wraiths, clearing every structure with ruthless efficiency. The Zyreen warriors were disciplined, trained in the tactics of honor-bound combat. But honor meant nothing when their opponents ignored the rules of engagement. Plasma fire tore through Zyreen ranks before they could organize a response. Human forces worked in tight-knit formations, moving through urban sectors with brutal coordination. Zyreen commanders barked out orders, but their soldiers hesitated, confused, afraid. No one had ever fought like this before. A Zyreen soldier raised his hands in surrender, standard protocol when facing overwhelming opposition. A gesture that, in every battle before, had signaled the end of the engagement. The human before him barely hesitated before pulling the trigger. The Zyreen's body collapsed, lifeless. Shock rippled through the surviving warriors. The humans weren't playing anymore. In orbit, Major Elias Vance watched in grim silence. From the bridge of the command carrier Iron Resolve, he observed the battlefield through cold, calculated projections. The Zyreen had walked into a war they didn't understand, and now they were learning a lesson humanity had known for millennia. There was no such thing as a bloodless war. Their fleet is repositioning, Sergeant Dana Quinn reported, her voice clipped and steady. Looks like they're trying to open negotiations. Vance exhaled slowly. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the control panel. Let them. The Zyreen flagship broadcast a signal, demanding a ceasefire. It was protocol. After a decisive battlefield shift, the victorious side was supposed to discuss terms, negotiate post-battle reparations, arrange for the restoration of occupied territories. Instead, Human Fleet Command jammed their communications. "Sir," Quinn murmured, glancing at him, "should we acknowledge their request?" Vance's gaze was hard, unreadable. "No. Keep the pressure on." For too long, humanity had been studied, observed, underestimated by the galactic community. They had been the young species, the outsiders, the ones who had to prove themselves worthy of standing among the great empires. The Zyreen had given them a chance to compete, expecting them to play by the rules. But humans didn't play war. They survived it. On the ground, Zyreen forces collapsed into chaos. Overseer Relvok felt the cold weight of true fear pressing against his chest. His warriors, bred for structured engagements, were breaking ranks, their formations collapsing. Under human firepower, their communications were disrupted, their retreat cut off. Every attempt to signal surrender was met with silence. The humans weren't interested in negotiations, and then the final transmission came, an intercepted human directive, translated through their imperfect understanding of Zyreen language. A single chilling phrase that sent waves of dread through the entire command structure. No prisoners. For the first time in their long, storied history, the Zyreen understood what war truly meant. There was no honor in this war, no structured engagements, no ceremonial duels. Only the unrelenting brutality of a species that had spent its entire existence fighting to survive. The Zyreen had miscalculated. From orbit, the battlefield was a study in chaos. Where once the Zyreen had moved in elegant formations, their tactics, woven into a dance of non-lethal superiority, they now scattered, Their once mighty forces, trained for contest rather than conquest, crumbled under the sheer force of human aggression. The battle was no longer about territory or status. It had become a reckoning. In the command hub of the Zyreen fleet, Overseer Relvok could barely process the report streaming in. Entire divisions gone, defensive fortifications shattered. Every protocol designed to end engagements cleanly was ignored. The humans would not stop. He struggled to understand. Have they acknowledged our surrender? The question left his lips, though he already knew the answer. His second-in-command's throat constricted as he read from the incoming transmissions. No response. There was no precedent for this. Never had a species refused to cease hostilities once victory was assured. Even in the worst scenarios, even when tensions ran high, surrender was a sacred act. It was the end of violence, the start of restoration. But to the humans, it seemed, surrender was not the end. It was the beginning of retribution. On the surface, the Zyreen forces fell back in disarray. They had trained for games of war, but the humans had trained for war itself. Fire teams of human soldiers moved through ruined streets, clearing each district with ruthless precision. Zyreen officers shouted orders, calling for regrouping, for counter-maneuvers, as if their words still held power. But their warriors were breaking. The Zyreen had never known fear like this, the kind that rooted itself in the bones, that made rational thought impossible. Their weapons, meant to disable, did little against enemies who did not hesitate to kill. And so they ran. From alleys, from collapsed structures, from defensive outposts turned into tombs, they abandoned the battlefield entirely. Some discarded their weapons. Some dropped to their knees, raising their hands in desperate pleas for mercy. But there was no mercy in the eyes of the humans. Major Elias Vance led the final push. Through the dust-choked ruins of what was once a Zyreen-controlled city, he moved, with grim efficiency, his team fanning out beside him. No wasted movements, no wasted bullets. Every shot deliberate, every strike measured. A Zyreen officer stood in his path, hands raised high. The alien's violet skin shimmered with perspiration, trembling fingers forming the universal sign of surrender. Initiate restoration, the Zyreen begged, voice quivering. By the rules of the trials, A single gunshot cut through the air. The Zyreen collapsed, his body crumpling like paper. Vance didn't blink. Behind him, Sergeant Dana Quinn inhaled sharply. That was an officer, she muttered. He surrendered. Vance's jaw was set. His voice, when it came, was cold steel. They didn't follow the rules when they took our colony. We don't follow them now. Quinn hesitated, her fingers flexing over her rifle grip. This wasn't war. Not the kind they were trained for. This was something darker, something deeper. But she didn't argue, because in her heart, she knew Vance was right. Overseer Relvok watched the slaughter from orbit. What had begun as a ceremonial engagement had become a massacre. The humans weren't conquering, they weren't negotiating, they were punishing. His breath was shallow. He had to end this. With trembling fingers, he activated the emergency diplomatic override, a transmission frequency that no species had ever denied before. Human command, this is Overseer Relvok. His voice shook, but he forced himself to continue. We surrender. We forfeit the great trials. This war is over. Seconds passed, then minutes. The silence was suffocating. Then, at last, a response. A single voice. Vance's voice. No, it's not. Across the battlefield, human forces did not stop. They did not acknowledge the surrender. They did not lay down their weapons. Because for the first time, humanity was not fighting for land, or for strategy, or for political maneuvering. They were fighting for something older, something primal. They were fighting for vengeance. The Zyreen had surrendered. It didn't matter. The humans didn't stop. Overseer Relvok's breath came in ragged gasps. From the bridge of his flagship, he stared at the battlefield below, watching, His forces crumble in real time. He had done everything that galactic law dictated. He had sent the surrender signal. He had deactivated his remaining defenses. He had ordered every surviving Zyreen warrior to lay down their weapons, to make it clear this was over. But the humans kept coming. For the first time in his long, illustrious career, Relvok understood what it meant to be prey. A low, panicked murmur spread through his command deck as officers fumbled at their consoles. Their usual composure shattered. They couldn't make sense of it. The great trials had never ended this way. "What do we do?" A younger tactician whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of failing systems. Relvok had no answer. On the ground, the Zyreen survivors had nowhere left to run. Through the smoke and the ruin, through shattered buildings and bodies left where they fell, the human advance was unstoppable. Plasma fire lit the streets. Screams cut short. Zyreen warriors, once proud and unshaken, collapsed. In the dirt, their ceremonial armor stained with something they had never seen before, blood. Some still begged for mercy. Some tried to explain. "This was never meant to be real. We didn't know. Please, stop." It made no difference. There was no stopping this. No stopping them. Major Elias Vance stood at the center of it all. Through the haze of battle, he moved, with the unshakable certainty of a man who knew exactly what had to be done. A Zyreen officer, a high-ranking one, crawled toward him, his leg mangled, his violet skin slick with the thick, dark ichor of his kind. His breathing was sharp and shallow, his four-fingered hands lifted in a desperate plea. "We yield," the officer gasped. "The Zyreen Imperium yields." Vance looked down at him, expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he raised his sidearm and fired. The Zyreen's body jerked, then went still. Sergeant Dana Quinn flinched. "We're executing them now?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Vance didn't turn to face her. They attacked a human colony. She swallowed hard. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that they had won, that the Zyreen weren't resisting anymore, that this wasn't necessary. But she didn't, because she had seen the footage. She had seen what the Zyreen had done to that colony, not understanding, not caring, treating it like a game where the humans had been the pieces where their people had suffered and bled and died while the Zyreen laughed, believing it would all be restored afterward. This wasn't a game, and now they knew. Overseer Relvok fell to his knees. The humans had cut off his escape. His fleet was crippled, his warriors dead or scattered. Every request for ceasefire was met with silence. The battle was over. The war was over. But the killing continued. This wasn't warfare anymore, this was something else. Something far worse. His people had never known genocide, had never even considered the possibility of a war that didn't end when the fighting stopped. But the humans had known. The humans had lived it. They had never forgotten it. And now neither would the Zyreen. His vision blurred. His breath caught in his throat. He had thought himself a warrior once, a strategist, a leader. But he had never known what it meant to fight something that did not stop. The last thing he saw before the human forces breached his command center was the cold, implacable glare of Major Elias Vance. And in that moment, Relvok understood. They had never stood a chance. The silence after the storm was the loudest thing of all. The battlefield was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. Zyreen bodies lay where they had fallen, their ceremonial armor shattered, their weapons discarded. The once proud warriors of the Imperium, who had marched into the great trials with honor, had learned the price of real war and paid it in blood. The human forces stood among the ruins, their weapons still in hand, their breathing steady despite the carnage around them. There were no cheers of victory, no celebrations, just the cold, unshakable truth of what they had done. They had not won a battle. They had delivered a lesson. Major Elias Vance surveyed the aftermath with unreadable eyes. The Zyreen had been utterly defeated. Their fleet crippled, their leadership dead or captured, their warriors broken. He had fought in wars before, seen men and women die, watched civilizations fall. But never had he witnessed this, a complete and total collapse, not just of an enemy's forces, but of their entire understanding of reality. A movement caught his attention. One of the surviving Zyreen officers slumped against a wrecked transport was staring at him. Not with hatred, not with defiance, with horror. The Zyreen finally understood, and somehow that should have made Vance feel something. But it didn't. Sergeant Dana Quinn exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around her rifle. It was over. They had won. The Zyreen had surrendered dozens of times over, but they had kept going. Kept pushing, kept killing. A part of her knew why. Knew that it had been necessary. The Zyreen had treated war like a performance, a ritual, as if lives lost could be undone at the end of the game. They had needed to learn. But now, standing here in the wreckage of their civilization, Quinn wondered if humanity had gone too far. She looked at Vance. His expression hadn't changed since the beginning of the campaign. Stone. Unmoved. "Sir?" she said, quiet. "What now?" For the first time, he hesitated. Then he turned toward the sky, toward the stars, toward the endless unknown. "We move on. No remorse, no regret. Because this had never been about winning. This had been about making sure it never happened again. And now, it wouldn't. Because the Zyreen would never forget, and neither would humanity." The Zyreen homeworld stood in eerie silence. For the first time in recorded history, the great halls of their war academies were empty. The arenas where warriors once trained in the art of ceremonial combat lay abandoned, their once pristine grounds stained with the truth of their folly. Across the Imperium, the message had spread. The humans do not play war. The great trials were over. No species would ever challenge humanity again. Overseer Relvok stood before the Imperial Council, his posture heavy with the weight of what he had witnessed. He had survived. Barely. But survival came with a cost. He had seen his warriors, his people hunted, slaughtered, erased. He had felt the cold efficiency of a species that did not war for sport, but for survival. "Never again," a council member whispered, her voice trembling. "Never again will we engage in war." There were no dissenting voices, no debates. The Zyreen had learned their lesson, and the galaxy had learned it too. Aboard the human command ship, Major Elias Vance sat in silence. The war, if it could even be called that, was over. The Zyreen had been shattered, their arrogance crushed beneath the weight of reality. Humanity had proven its point, so why did it feel so empty? He stared out at the void, at the endless stretch of stars beyond, wondering who else was watching, because someone was. The humans had been the underdogs once, the unknown species on the galactic stage. Not anymore. Somewhere out there, another empire was watching, waiting, calculating. And when the next challenge came, Vance knew humanity would be ready. Let this be known across all starfaring nations. The Zyreen Imperium formally declares an end to the great trials. The human species has demonstrated a fundamental difference in warfare philosophy that renders continued participation impossible. We urge all civilizations to reconsider any engagement with humanity on the field of battle. This is not a warning. This is a plea. Do not make the same mistake we did. The message spread. The galaxy listened, and somewhere in the darkness between the stars, something stirred. Something that understood humanity would not hesitate. Not ever again.